"That's my father's horse." The boy's voice was small but clear, cutting through the damp air of the woods. He stood at the edge of a muddy track, a tiny, determined figure clutching a handful of wildflowers. Before him, a great black stallion, its coat lathered with sweat and foam, stood trembling, one leg held at an awkward angle. The saddle was empty. The reins were tangled in a hawthorn bush. A little farther down the path, almost hidden in a ditch choked with ferns and last year's dead leaves, lay a man. He was sprawled on his back, his fine woolen coat torn and smeared with mud. One booted leg was twisted beneath him. His face, turned towards the bruised purple sky, was pale as marble, except for the dark, ugly gash blooming across his temple. The boy, Julian, took a cautious step closer. He was only 6 years old, but he knew horses, and he knew this horse. He had seen it in a dream his mother had given him. A story whispered late at night about a man who rode a horse as black as midnight, a man with a hawk on his ring. He edged past the distressed stallion, his small boots sinking into the wet earth. He knelt beside the fallen man, his breath puffing in white clouds. The man's eyes were closed. He was breathing, a shallow, unsteady rhythm. Julian reached out a hesitant, grubby finger and touched the man's hand. It was cold. On that hand, glinting even in the dim light, was a heavy gold ring. Carved into its surface was a hawk, its wings spread wide, its talons clutching a serpent. The dream was real. "Papa?" he whispered. The word felt strange and momentous on his tongue. There was no response. The man remained unnervingly still. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at Julian's skin, overriding his awe. He scrambled to his feet, the wildflowers forgotten, spilling across the mud. He turned and ran, his little legs pumping as fast as they could, back toward the warm lights of the village, back toward the only safety he had ever known. "Mama!" he cried, bursting through the door of the Weary Traveler Inn, his voice a raw gasp. "Mama, he's here!" Alara, known to the good people of Oakhaven as Lena, looked up from the tablecloth she was mending. Her needle froze mid-stitch. Her son stood before her, his face streaked with dirt and tears, his chest heaving. For 7 years, her world had been this small, safe bubble, this cozy inn, the scent of baking bread and wood smoke, the steady rhythm of her work, and the fierce, all-consuming love for her child. That bubble had just burst. "Julian, what is it? What's happened?" she asked, her voice tight with the ever-present fear of a woman in hiding. "In the woods," he panted, pointing a trembling finger back the way he had come. "The black horse. And the man. He's hurt, Mama. The man from the story." A cold dread, familiar and sickening, washed over Alara. It was the same feeling that had gripped her 7 years ago, in a gilded ballroom, under the weight of 1,000 judging eyes. The man from the story. She had told Julian tales, of course, vague, romanticized stories of a brave, faraway father, a duke no less, to explain his absence. She had described the horse, the ring, the crest. She had never imagined the story would walk out of the shadows and bleed onto a muddy track just a mile from her sanctuary. "Show me," she said, her voice a dead, flat thing. She grabbed a thick cloak and followed her son out into the failing light. Mrs. Gable, the stout, kind-hearted innkeeper, called after her, but Alara did not stop. She walked as if in a trance, her mind a maelstrom of terror and disbelief. It could not be him, not here, after all this time. The world was not that cruel, but it was. She saw the stallion first, its powerful form a silhouette of black against the gray twilight. And then she saw him, the ditch, the sprawled figure. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She stopped a few feet away, her hand flying to her mouth. Even covered in mud and blood, there was no mistaking him. The proud line of his jaw, the dark, thick hair, the sheer size of him. He was a force of nature, even when broken. Alaric Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood, her husband, the man who had called her an adulteress, who had believed the venomous lies of his brother, who had cast her out into the cold without a second thought, not knowing she carried his son. A wave of nausea churned in her stomach. She wanted to turn and run, to grab Julian and disappear again, to find another village, another life. But she was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the sight of him. He was hurt, badly. Whatever rage and bitterness she had nurtured for 7 years withered in the face of his stark vulnerability. Is he sleeping?" Julian whispered, clinging to her cloak. Alara forced herself to move. She knelt beside him, just as her son had done. Her fingers, trembling violently, went to his neck, searching for a pulse. It was there, thready but present. His skin was clammy. The wound on his head was deep, the blood matted in his dark hair. "No, darling," she managed to say, her voice thick. "He is not sleeping." She looked at the expensive, ruined clothes, the aristocratic face, the signet ring that screamed his identity to the world. He was a duke. Here, in this remote corner of the world, where she was just Lena, the seamstress. Bringing him to the village would be a cataclysm. Leaving him here would be murder. There was no choice. There never had been. "Run back to the inn," she told Julian, her tone firm, masking the panic that threatened to consume her. "Tell Mrs. Gable to send Tom and John with a cart. Tell them a traveler has had an accident. Do not say anything else. Do you understand, Julian? Not a word about who you think he is." The boy nodded, his eyes wide with confusion and fear, and scurried away. Alara was alone with the ghost of her past. She gently brushed a lock of damp hair from his forehead. He groaned, a low, pained sound that twisted something deep inside her. For 7 years, she had imagined this moment. In her fantasies, she was strong, cold, and vengeful. She would face him with her head held high, show him the son he had abandoned, and watch him crumble with regret. The reality was this: mud, blood, and a pity so profound it felt like a betrayal of her own survival. The man who had destroyed her life was helpless at her feet, and her first instinct was not to curse him, but to save him. The irony was a bitter pill in her throat. The cart arrived, rumbling and creaking, its lantern casting long, dancing shadows. Tom and John, the unsturdy stable hands, were grim-faced as they assessed the situation. With a great deal of grunting and careful maneuvering, they lifted the Duke's heavy, unconscious form onto the back of the cart, laying him on a bed of old straw sacks. Alara climbed in beside him, cradling his head in her lap, her fine mending forgotten in favor of this terrible, intimate duty. The ride back to Oakhaven was a slow, jolting nightmare. Every bump and rut in the road seemed to send a fresh wave of pain through Alaric's body, drawing pained murmurs from his lips. Alara held him steady, her mind numb. She felt like a character in a Greek tragedy, dragged back into a drama she had fought so hard to escape. When they reached the inn, Mrs. Gable was waiting, her face a mask of concern. She took one look at the man on the cart and her eyes widened. She was a discreet woman, but even she could recognize quality when she saw it, and this man, despite his state, was dripping with it. "Saints above, Lena. Who is he?" she whispered, as they carried him inside. "I do not know," Alara lied, the words tasting like ash. "A traveler." They put him in the best guest room, the one with the feather bed and the view of the church spire. Alara, with Mrs. Gable's help, worked through the night. They sent for the village doctor, a kindly old man with shaky hands and a knowledge of herbs. He cleaned and stitched the gash on Alaric's head, tutting over the severity of the blow. He set the broken bone in his leg, binding it with rough splints. "A nasty fall," the doctor declared, packing his bag. "He is strong, but the head wound worries me. We can only wait. Keep him warm. Try to get some broth into him if he wakes." Alara sat by the bedside, watching Alaric breathe. She had undressed him, her hands clinical and detached as she removed the ruined coat and shirt. She had washed the blood and grime from his skin. It was the most intimate contact they had shared in 7 years, and he was completely unaware of it. His body was broader, harder than she remembered. Lines of care were etched around his eyes and mouth that had not been there before. He was no longer the arrogant, untouchable young duke she had married. He was a man, weathered by time, and it seemed by some sorrow she could not guess at. She watched the rise and fall of his chest, a slow, agonizing metronome counting down to the moment he would wake up. What would she do? What would she say? "Hello, Your Grace. It is I, the wife you publicly shamed and discarded. And by the way, the little boy who found you as your son and heir." The thought was so absurdly, terrifyingly theatrical that a hysterical laugh bubbled in her chest. She choked it down. He remained unconscious for 3 days. 3 days in which Alara barely slept or ate. She moved in a fog, tending to him, changing his bandages, sitting by his side while Julian played quietly in the corner of the room, watching the strange man in the bed with a mixture of fear and fascination. "Is he going to wake up?" Julian asked on the 3rd evening, his voice small. "I hope so, my love," Alara said, stroking his hair. And then, as if summoned by the words, Alaric stirred. His eyelids fluttered. He groaned, a deep guttural sound of pain and confusion. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, opened. They scanned the unfamiliar room, the low, beamed ceiling, the chintz curtains. They were unfocused, clouded with pain. Then they landed on her. Alara's breath caught in her throat. She braced herself for the explosion, for the recognition, the anger, the shock. He stared at her for a long moment, a frown creasing his brow. Who are you?" he rasped, his voice raw. The question hit her with the force of a physical blow. It was not the question she had prepared for. "Where am I?" he asked, trying to push himself up and crying out as pain shot through his leg. "Be still," she said, her voice trembling slightly as she pushed him gently back against the pillows. "You have had an accident. You are in a village called Oakhaven, at an inn." He absorbed this slowly, his gaze still fixed on her face. There was no recognition in it. None at all. Just a vast, empty confusion. "My name," he said, his voice cracking. I cannot remember my name." The doctor had warned it was a possibility. A blow to the head could steal a man's memories. Alara had dismissed it, a fanciful notion. But looking into those empty gray eyes, she knew it was true. He had no idea who he was. He had no idea who she was. The Duke of Blackwood, the man who held her life in his hands, was gone. In his place was a stranger, as lost and vulnerable as a child. A terrible, dangerous thought began to form in her mind, a thought that offered both a shield and a prison. He was a blank slate. She could write anything she wanted on it. She could protect herself. She could protect Julian. All she had to do was continue the lie. "We do not know your name," she said, her heart pounding a guilty rhythm. "We found no papers on you. We have just been calling you Alaric. It seemed to suit you." She used his name deliberately, a test. It sparked nothing. He simply nodded, accepting it. "Alaric," he repeated, as if trying on a new coat. "And you are?" "I am Lena," she said, her new name feeling solid and real, a wall between her and the past. "And this," she added, pulling Julian forward, "is my son, Julian." Alaric's gaze fell on the boy. He saw the wide, curious eyes, so like his own, but he did not know it. He just saw a child staring at him. He managed a weak, pained smile. "He is the one who found you," Alara added quietly. A new kind of protectorate was born in that moment, not of a duchess fleeing a duke, but of a woman shielding a child and a broken man from a truth that could destroy them all. The rage she had carried for years was useless now. In its place was a complicated, terrifying pity, and a profound sense of dread for the day the memories would inevitably return. For now, he was just Alaric, the traveler, and she was just Lena, the woman who had saved him. The lie was a fragile shelter, and she pulled it around them like a threadbare blanket against a coming storm. Days turned into a week, then two. Alaric, as he was now known, recovered slowly. The pain in his head subsided, leaving him with a persistent, disorienting fog and a complete absence of personal memory. He knew things. He knew that the king was on the throne. He knew how to read and write with an elegant, practiced hand. He knew the difference between a claret and a burgundy. But he did not know his own history. He did not know his favorite color, or his mother's name, or the face of a single friend. It was as if his life was a book with the first 20 chapters ripped out. He was a frustrating patient, and a surprisingly gentle one. The arrogance Alara remembered was gone, stripped away with his title and his memory. This man was quiet, observant, and possessed a deep, weary sadness he could not explain. He was also fiercely intelligent, and his confinement to the bed chafed at him. Alara was his constant companion, his only link to this new reality. She brought him his meals, changed his bandages, read to him from the inn's small collection of books. She was careful, guarded, keeping a wall of polite distance between them. But it was a wall with cracks. She found herself watching him when he slept. The harsh lines of his face softened, looking younger, more like the man she had first fallen in love with. The most dangerous crack in her wall was Julian. The boy, his initial fear replaced by a proprietary curiosity, was a frequent visitor to the sick room. He would sit on a small stool by the bed and pepper Alaric with questions. "Can you ride a horse very fast?" he asked one afternoon. Alaric smiled, a genuine, unforced smile that made Alara's heart ache. "I have a feeling I can," he said, "though I will not be trying it for some time." "My father can," Julian announced proudly. "He has a horse as black as night." Alara froze, her hands tightening on the sewing in her lap. She shot a warning look at her son, but it was too late. Alaric's brow furrowed. "Does he?" he asked, his voice soft. "Where is your father?" Julian looked to his mother, suddenly uncertain. "He is away," Alara cut in smoothly, her heart racing. "He is a soldier." It was another lie, stacked precariously on the first. She felt sick with the deceit, but the alternative was unthinkable. Alaric's gaze shifted to her, his gray eyes searching her face. "That must be difficult for you." "We manage," she said stiffly, turning her attention back to her needlework, her cheeks burning. The intimacy of the sick room was a form of torture. She was tending to the man who was both her greatest love and her greatest wound. Every small kindness from him was a fresh stab of pain, a reminder of what she had lost, of the man he could have been if not for the poison of pride and suspicion. He would occasionally look at her with an intensity that made her breath catch, a flicker of something that felt like recognition, but it was a ghost of an emotion, a familiarity he could not place. "Have we met before, Lena?" he asked one day, his voice low. "Sometimes, when you speak, your voice, it feels known to me." "This is a small country, sir," she deflected, her voice cooler than she intended. "Perhaps our paths crossed once in a market or on a road." He accepted the explanation, but the searching look in his eyes did not fade. He was a puzzle trying to solve itself, and she was the most intriguing piece. While Alaric healed in Oakhaven, his absence was causing ripples in another world. At Blackwood Manor, a grand cold palace of stone and silk, Lord Cassian Beaumont was growing impatient. It had been 3 weeks since his brother had ridden out in a fit of temper and vanished. Alaric had been prone to such moods lately, a brooding discontent that had settled over him in the years since he had sent his wife away. Cassian had assumed he would return in a day or two, chastened and silent as always, but he had not. The stallion, discovered lame by a tenant farmer, had been brought back to the stables. Of the Duke, there was no sign. Search parties had scoured the estate and the surrounding lands to no avail. Cassian stood in Alaric's study, a glass of brandy in his hand. He ran his fingers over the polished mahogany of the desk. This room, this house, this title, it was all within his grasp. He had planted the seeds of doubt about Alara 7 years ago, nurturing them with forged letters and whispered innuendo until Alaric's pride had done the rest. He had expected his brother to remarry, to produce a new heir, but Alaric had retreated into a shell of cold duty, the life gone from his eyes. He had never taken another wife, which meant that if Alaric was well and truly gone, the dukedom and all its immense wealth would pass to Cassian. He had not planned the accident, not exactly, but he had known Alaric was riding his most spirited, unpredictable stallion, and he had done nothing to stop him. He had simply watched him go, a silent prayer on his lips. Now all he had to do was wait. He began to quietly assert his authority, giving orders to the staff, meeting with the estate manager. He was the master in all but name. A nagging worry persisted, however. Mr. Davies, the Duke's longtime man of business, was a shrewd and stubbornly loyal old man. Davies had never liked him, and he had been quietly asking questions, organizing his own search parties, refusing to accept that the Duke was simply gone. Cassian would have to be careful. He needed to find Alaric, or proof of his death, before Davies uncovered something he should not. Back in Oakhaven, Alaric was finally allowed out of bed. His leg was still in a splint, and he relied on a crude crutch, but the freedom to move was a balm to his restless spirit. He was a strange sight in the common room of the inn, a man with the bearing of a king and the clothes of a commoner, which Mrs. Gable had procured for him. He was quiet, but his presence filled the room. He tried to make himself useful. He could not do heavy work, but he sat by the fire, peeling potatoes or mending a broken chair with surprising skill. He was trying to earn his keep, a concept that would have been laughably alien to the Duke of Blackwood. His bond with Julian deepened. He would spend hours with the boy, listening to his chatter, teaching him how to carve a piece of wood into a bird. He was patient and gentle, a natural father. Watching them together was a sweet agony for Alara. This was the life she had dreamed of, a phantom reality built on a foundation of lies. One afternoon, she found them in the small garden behind the inn. Alaric was sitting on a bench, and Julian was trying to explain the rules of a game involving pebbles in a chalk circle. "You see, you have to throw it right in the middle," Julian instructed, his face a mask of concentration. Alaric watched him, a soft, wistful expression on his face. "He is a fine boy, Lena," he said as she approached. "You have raised him well." "Thank you," she said, her voice tight. "His father," Alaric began, then hesitated. "The soldier. Will he be returning soon?" The question hung in the air between them, Alara's carefully constructed world tilted on its axis. "It is unlikely," she said, the words almost choking her. "He is considered lost." Alaric's gaze was full of a deep, unmerited compassion. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "To lose someone you love, it must be the greatest pain." The sincerity in his voice broke her. She turned away, pretending to inspect a rosebush, but it was to hide the sudden sting of tears in her eyes. He was apologizing for a grief he himself had caused. The absurdity, the sheer crushing weight of her secret, was becoming unbearable. That night, she could not sleep. She crept from her small room and went downstairs. A single lamp was lit in the common room. Alaric was sitting by the cold hearth, staring into the darkness. He had not been sleeping well, plagued by fractured dreams that made no sense, fleeting images of a grand staircase, a woman's laughter, the scent of rain on stone. "You are awake," she said softly. He looked up, startled. "I could not quiet my mind," he admitted. "It is like a house with all the doors locked. I can hear noises inside, but I cannot get in." He looked at her, his eyes shadowed with frustration and a profound loneliness. "Tell me something, Lena. Anything. Tell me about your husband." Her blood ran cold. "Why?" "Because I want to know what it is like," he said, his voice raw with a need he did not understand. "To have a life. To have someone. I have nothing. I am no one." She sat down in the chair opposite him, the wooden table between them a flimsy barrier. She could not tell him the truth, but perhaps she could tell him a version of it. "He was proud," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "He was a good man, I think, but his pride was a fortress. He listened to whispers. He let other people's jealousy and lies poison his mind. He did not trust me. And when you do not have trust, you have nothing." She was not looking at him, but at her own hands, twisting in her lap. She was speaking of the Duke of Blackwood, but she was also issuing a warning to the man in front of her. Alaric was silent for a long time. The firelight flickered, casting shadows that danced like ghosts on the walls. "He was a fool then," he said at last, his voice thick with an emotion she could not name. "To have a woman like you and not trust her. He was a damn fool." Her head snapped up. He was looking at her with an intensity that stripped the air from her lungs. It was not the gaze of a duke assessing his property. It was the gaze of a man seeing a woman, and in that moment, the carefully constructed walls between Lena the seamstress and Alaric the traveler crumbled into dust. The moment was broken by the sound of hoofbeats in the yard, a carriage rattling to a stop. It was late for visitors. Mrs. Gable bustled out, and they could hear hushed, urgent voices. A man entered the inn, brushing road dust from his coat. He was older, with a shrewd, worried face. He stopped dead in the doorway of the common room, his eyes locking on Alaric. "Your Grace," the man breathed, his face a mixture of shock and profound relief. "We have been searching for weeks. We feared the worst." Alara's world stopped. The lie was over. The man was Mr. Davies, Alaric's man of business. He rushed forward, his professional decorum forgotten. "My Lord Duke, are you injured? What has happened?" Alaric stared at him, utterly bewildered. He looked from the frantic man to Alara, his eyes wide with confusion. "Duke?" he repeated, the word alien on his tongue. "You are mistaken. My name is Alaric." Davies stopped, his brow furrowing. "Yes, Your Grace. Alaric Beaumont, Duke of Blackwood. Have you... Sir, do you not know who I am?" "I do not know who I am," Alaric said, his voice flat. He pushed himself to his feet, leaning heavily on his crutch, a towering figure of confusion and dawning horror. He looked at Alara, a desperate, accusing question in his eyes. "Lena?" Alara felt the blood drain from her face. The truth was here, loud and undeniable, in the form of this fussy, loyal man. She could not speak. She could only stare back at Alaric, her guilt and fear a tangible thing between them. Davies, sensing a delicate situation, lowered his voice. "Your Grace, you have suffered a head injury. You have lost your memory. This is Blackwood land. You are the master here." He glanced at Alara, a flicker of recognition dawning in his own eyes. He had only seen the Duchess a few times, years ago, but there was something familiar about her face. His gaze dropped to Julian, who had been woken by the commotion and was peeking around the doorframe. The boy had the unmistakable Beaumont eyes. Davies's mind, sharp and accustomed to connecting disparate facts, began to work. "You called me a duke," Alaric said, his voice dangerously quiet. His eyes never left Alara's face. "You let me peel potatoes in your kitchen and sleep in a guest room. You let me believe I was no one." She started, but the words would not come. What could she say? "I did it to protect myself from you?" How could he understand the man he had been? "And the boy," Alaric continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper as a horrifying suspicion began to dawn. My son, the soldier, he quoted her own words back at her, the irony a razor's edge. He looked at Julian, truly looked at him, and then back at his own reflection, faint in the dark window pane. He saw the same gray eyes, the same stubborn set of the jaw. The locked doors in his mind began to tremble. A flash of an image, a woman with honey-colored hair, laughing in a sunlit garden, the scent of her perfume, the cold, gutting fury of betrayal. It was not a memory, but the shadow of one, an emotion without context. "Who are you?" he demanded of Alara, the quiet question more terrifying than any shout. "Who are you to me?" Before she could answer, Davies, pale and trembling, stepped forward. "Your Grace," he said, his voice shaking. This is Her Grace, the Duchess of Blackwood. This is your wife." The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavier than stone, deeper than a grave. Alaric stared at Alara, and for the first time, the blank confusion in his eyes was replaced by something else, the dawning of a colossal, world-shattering truth. He was a duke. This quiet, sad woman was his duchess. The boy was his son. And he had remembered none of it. He had been living a lie, and she had been its silent, watchful guardian. The strength seemed to leave his legs. He sank back into the chair, his face ashen. The lost traveler was gone. The Duke of Blackwood was back, and he was staring into the ruins of a life he could not remember destroying. The revelation shattered the fragile peace of the inn. Mr. Davies, flustered but efficient, tried to take command. He spoke of returning to the manor, of summoning the finest doctors from London. Alaric ignored him. His entire being was focused on Alara, who stood pale and silent, her arms wrapped around Julian as if to shield him from the fallout. "My wife," Alaric said, the words hollow. He looked at his own hands, at the signet ring that suddenly felt like a brand. "Why?" It was the only question that mattered. "Why did you not tell me?" Alara finally found her voice, and it was laced with 7 years of frozen fury. "Tell you? Tell you what? That you are the man who humiliated me in front of the entire peerage? That you believed the word of a snake over your own wife? That you threw me out, pregnant and alone, and never once looked back? What would have been the point, Your Grace? You would not have remembered." The formal title was a slap. It erected a wall of ice between them. Davies gasped, his gaze darting between them. He had known the Duchess had left under a cloud of scandal, but the stark reality of her accusation, pregnant and alone, was horrifying. Alaric flinched as if she had struck him. The words meant nothing to his memory, but he could feel the weight of their truth. He saw the raw pain in her eyes, the protective curve of her body around the child, his child, a son. He had a son. "I did that?" he whispered, the question directed more to himself than to her. The man she described sounded like a monster. He looked at his hands, trying to reconcile them with the hands of such a cruel man. "You did," she confirmed, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Now your man has found you. You can return to your grand house and your important life. We will not trouble you further." She turned to leave, pulling Julian with her. "No," Alaric said, his voice ringing with an authority that surprised them all. It was the Duke's voice, the voice of command. He pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the pain in his leg. "You will not go." He took a step toward her, his crutch thumping on the wooden floor. "I do not remember," he said, his voice raw. "On my honor, I do not. But I will, and I will not leave this place until I understand." He looked at Davies. "You will find lodgings in the village. You will tell no one at Blackwood that you have found me. You will send a message to your office in London and hire the best investigators you can find. I want to know everything that happened 7 years ago. I want to know who whispered lies." His gaze fell on Cassian's name in his mind, a name that evoked a faint, sour feeling, like spoiled wine. Especially, he added, his voice hardening, about my brother. Davies, stunned by the Duke's rapid shift from lost amnesiac to decisive commander, could only nod. Yes, Your Grace. Alaric then turned back to Alara. The command in his eyes softened, replaced by a desperate plea. Please, he said, his voice dropping. Do not run from me again. Let me stay. Let me earn my keep. He gestured around the humble common room. I was happier here, peeling your potatoes, than I have been in years, though I do not know why. Let me understand why. Alara looked at him, at this impossible man who was two people at once, the cold Duke who had condemned her, and the gentle stranger who had taught her son to carve a bird. Her heart was a battlefield. Her mind screamed at her to run, to protect herself. But his plea and the genuine agonizing confusion in his eyes held her fast. And there was Julian, watching them both, his small face etched with worry. Running would mean tearing him away from the father he had just found. You may stay, she said at last, her voice barely audible. For now. It was not forgiveness. It was not a truce. It was an armistice, fragile and temporary, on a field still littered with the wreckage of the past. Alaric did not return to the manor. He remained at the inn, a duke in exile just a few miles from his own palace. He moved from the guest room to a small, Spartan chamber in the attic, insisting on it. He discarded the crutch as soon as he could, his limp a constant, nagging reminder of his brokenness, both physical and mental. His life became a strange penance. By day, he worked. He chopped wood, repaired the stables, and helped Tom with the horses. The manual labor was grueling, his body soft from years of aristocratic leisure, but he welcomed the exhaustion. It quieted the chaos in his mind. The villagers watched him with suspicion and awe. They knew who he was now. The story had spread like wildfire. But this humble, hard-working man bore no resemblance to their idea of a remote and powerful duke. His nights were spent in quiet torment. Mr. Davies would visit, bringing papers from the estate. Alaric would stare at the documents, at his own signature, and feel nothing. Davies also brought reports from the investigators in London. They were digging into the past, interviewing former servants, examining old bank ledgers. A picture began to form, one of Cassian's mounting debts and his constant, cloying presence at the Duke's side in the months before Alara's departure. But the true penance was Alara herself. She treated him with a cold, correct politeness that was more painful than any argument. She was her grace to him now, and he was your grace to her. They were strangers sharing a roof, bound together by a child who did not understand the chasm between them. Alaric's only solace was Julian. He sought out the boy, not as a duke claiming his heir, but as a man hungry for connection. He taught Julian to ride, not on a spirited stallion, but on a gentle old pony from the inn stable. He showed him how to properly groom a horse, how to check its hooves. He answered the boy's endless questions with a patience he did not know he possessed. "Did you really forget me?" Julian asked one day as they sat by the river, skipping stones. Alaric's hand stilled. "I forgot everyone, Julian," he said quietly. "Most of all, I forgot myself." "Mama did not forget you," Julian offered. "She has a picture of you. She keeps it in a little wooden box with her ring." Alaric looked at him, his heart clenching. A picture. A ring. She had kept them. After everything, she had kept them. Hope, a small and fragile thing, flickered within him. He tried to talk to her, to breach the wall of her reserve. He would find her in the evenings, mending by the fire, and simply sit in the room with her, in silence. He did not push, did not demand. He just existed in her space, letting his presence be a quiet, constant apology. One night, he brought her a cup of tea. She looked up, surprised. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. "Ilara," he began, using her name for the first time since the revelation. It felt like a prayer. "I know that sorry is a meaningless word from a man who cannot remember his crime, but I see the crime in your eyes, and I would give anything to undo it." She looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time in days. She saw the blisters on his hands, the weariness in his face. She saw the contrition of Alaric warring with the phantom pride of the Duke. "Why should I believe you have changed?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The moment your memory returns, will you not become him again? The man who trusted a liar and condemned his wife." It was the question that haunted him, too. "I do not know," he answered with brutal honesty. "But I know this. The man I am now, he would never have let you go. He would have fought the whole world for you." A memory flashed behind his eyes, sharp and painful. A ballroom, the scent of wilting flowers, Cassian's face, tight with false sympathy. "She has dishonored you, brother. There are letters." He remembered the feeling of cold, blind rage. He remembered turning his back on her pleading face. He staggered, putting a hand to his head, a sharp pain lancing through his skull. "Alaric?" Ilara cried, rising to her feet, her cold facade shattering. "The letters!" he gasped, his memory returning in a sickening flood. "He told me there were letters." The investigators found them a week later. They were not love letters from a secret paramour, as Cassian had claimed. They were forgeries, crude ones at that. But Alaric, in his arrogant fury, had been too blind to see it. They were written on paper that did not exist at the time of their supposed date. The handwriting, when compared to the supposed author, did not match. And the investigators also found something else: a groom from a neighboring estate who Cassian had paid to spread rumors, and a massive payment Cassian had made to a London forger just weeks before Ilara was cast out. Davies brought the evidence to the inn, his face grim. He laid it all out on the common room table: the forged letters, the signed affidavits, the bank records. It was a meticulous, irrefutable portrait of a calculated betrayal. Alaric stared at the proof, his memory now almost fully returned. He remembered everything: his coldness to Ilara in the first year of their marriage, his obsession with duty, his frustration with her quiet, gentle nature, which he had mistaken for weakness. He remembered his brother's insidious whispers, twisting his pride into a weapon. And he remembered that final, terrible scene, her face, pale and shocked, her denial lost beneath the weight of his ducal pronouncement. He had not even let her speak. He had been judge, jury, and executioner. The full weight of his monstrous failure crashed down upon him. He was not just a fool. He was a cruel, arrogant, blind fool. He had thrown away the only precious thing in his life on the word of a jealous viper. He looked up at Ilara, who had been watching him, her face unreadable. The pain in his own eyes was so profound, so devastating, that she took an involuntary step back. This was not the anger she had feared. This was the agony of a soul confronting its own damnation. Without a word, he turned and walked out of the inn. He did not take a horse. He walked, his limp pronounced, down the road toward Blackwood Manor. Ilara watched him go, her heart in her throat. Mrs. Gable came to stand beside her. "Where is he going?" "To face his brother," Ilara whispered. The confrontation was not the violent explosion Ilara might have imagined. Alaric arrived at the manor caked in dust, his face a granite mask of cold fury. He found Cassian in the study, drinking his brandy, acting the part of the Duke. Cassian's face went white when he saw him. "Alaric, you are alive." "No thanks to you," Alaric said, his voice deadly calm. He threw the bundle of evidence onto the desk. "Your little scheme is over, Cassian." Cassian blustered and denied, but the proof was absolute. Alaric did not raise his voice. He simply watched his brother's lies unravel, his expression one of utter contempt. He did not have him arrested. That would cause another scandal, and Alara had endured enough. Instead, he passed a sentence far worse. "You are no longer a Beaumont," Alaric said, his voice flat. "I will give you a sum of money, enough to disappear. You will go to the colonies. You will never use my family's name again. If I ever see your face or hear your name on this continent again, I will have you imprisoned for fraud and conspiracy, and you will rot there. Now get out of my house." Cassian, broken and exposed, fled. Alaric stood alone in the grand, silent study. He was the Duke of Blackwood again, his memory and his power restored. But the victory was hollow. He had purged the poison from his house, but the wound remained. He looked around the opulent room, at the portraits of his ancestors, at the trappings of his immense wealth. It all meant nothing, less than nothing. He had one more act of penance to perform. He did not stay at the manor. He walked back to Oakhaven as the sun was setting. He found Alara in the garden. She was sitting on the bench where he had first told her she had raised a fine boy. He did not approach her. He stopped a few feet away and knelt in the dirt. He, the Duke of Blackwood, knelt before her. "I remember everything," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "There is no excuse. There is no apology deep enough to cover what I did to you. I did not just break my vows. I broke you. I broke us. For pride. For nothing." He reached into his coat and pulled out the heavy signet ring. "This is what I was. This pride. This arrogance." He held it out to her. "But the man who chopped your wood and taught our son to skip stones, that is the man I want to be. If you will have him." He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not ask to be reinstated as her husband. He was offering her a choice. He was giving her all the power. Alara looked at the kneeling Duke, at the setting sun glinting off the ring in his outstretched hand. She saw the man who had hurt her beyond measure, but she also saw the man who had humbled himself, who had faced his own monstrous actions and had not flinched from the verdict. She saw the man who had earned the love of her son not through his title, but through his kindness. She saw Alaric, her Alaric, the one she had glimpsed all those years ago, before the world had poisoned him. Tears streamed down her face as she walked toward him. She did not take the ring. Instead, she reached out and gently pushed his hand, with the ring still on it, back toward his own chest. "Get up, you fool," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You will get your clothes dirty." He looked up, his face filled with a fragile, dawning hope. She held out her hand. He took it, his fingers closing around hers. He rose to his feet, and for the first time in 7 years, he pulled his wife into his arms. He buried his face in her hair, and his body shook with the force of his relief. She held him tightly, her tears soaking his dusty coat. It was not an ending. It was a beginning, fragile and new, built not on lies or pride, but on the hard, painful ground of atonement. They returned to Blackwood Manor, but it was not the same house. The silence was replaced by the sound of a child's laughter, echoing in the long corridors. The cold, formal rooms were filled with wildflowers from the inn's garden. Alara was not just the Duchess. She was Alaric's partner. He consulted her on everything, from the estate ledgers to the color of new curtains. Her quiet strength, which he had once mistaken for weakness, became his anchor. Alaric became a different kind of duke. He took an interest in his tenants, not as sources of income, but as people. He endowed a new school in Oakhaven. He used his power not to command, but to serve. The change in him was profound and lasting. The amnesia had not erased the Duke. It had revealed the man, and Alaric chose to be that man every single day. One crisp autumn afternoon, months later, Alara stood on the great lawn, watching Alaric and Julian. Alaric was teaching the boy to fly a kite, his laughter carrying on the wind. He was no longer the imposing, remote figure of her past. He was simply a man, a husband, a father, his face alight with a joy he had never known before his fall. He caught her eye and smiled, a smile of such pure, unadulterated love that it took her breath away. In that moment, she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that the crash had not just taken the Duke's memory. It had given him back his soul. And in doing so, it had given her back the man she had always loved, finally whole, finally home.